So the entire base and main structure of this is made out of this 1/2 inch project foam that I got from Walmart. I got this entire roll for about $10. So what I'm doing now is tracing out my pattern and then modifying it so it's a bit more accurate and a bit more what I want for her season 7 montrals. This pattern is kind of Frankenstein between two previous patterns that I have, and then I just modified it to be a bit more of what I want. So I'm just tracing out all of the pieces that I need, modifying them as I need it, and then I will be cutting them out. So now I'm cutting them out. I'm just using a regular pair of scissors, nothing too fancy here, and just cutting it out on that line. You don't need any seam allowance for this foam or anything, so that's real nice. I am taking some of the pieces that I cut out and then tracing them again so that I can have one for each side, because some of these pieces I didn't have a pattern for and just kind of drew them on and made it up. So now what I'm doing is pinning this together. I pin all the pieces together so I can get a pretty good idea of how it will look once I sew it together, and then I can make any modifications right now before I sew it together. So here I am making some modifications after I pinned it together. So I'm unpinning it and then transferring those modifications to both sides. I decided that I wanted to make her front leku a little thinner. So I'm just trimming a little bit of fabric off and then pinning it all back together. So here I am pinning on the back leku. And then once I have this back leku pinned on, I will carefully try this on. This is right now a pin cushion of death, so I will try it on being very mindful of where all those pins are so that I can get a pretty good idea of how it will look overall and how it will fit. Okay, so I am happy with the shape, and now I'm starting to sew it together. The way I sewed this together was just with a simple needle and thread. The foam is all hand sewn together, and I'm using kind of like a ladder stitch or a zipper stitch where I go in the fabric and then come up in between them and then go to the other side. There are a couple of different stitches you could use to sew this together. You could use a whip stitch, you could use a Henson stitch, which is also called a puppet stitch or an invisible stitch, to sew this all together. You could glue it if you want to, if you really don't feel like hand sewing it. So once it is all sewn together, I am taking some white spandex and draping it over the fabric. I am pulling the spandex tight, not too tight because I don't want to cause any warping to the foam, and I am trying to have as few wrinkles as possible with as few seams as possible. I would recommend using any type of stretch knit for this. If you don't feel comfortable with draping the fabric, you can just reuse the patterns that you used for the foam and cut it out of the fabric and then sew that together. It will probably result in more seams, but if you're not comfortable with draping, that is another alternative. So once I have the fabric draped on, I do trim off the excess, and what I'm doing right now is just going through with a basic running stitch, so it'll hold the fabric a bit better than pins, and will help me kind of refine the shape a little bit and try and get a few more of those wrinkles out and prepare it for sewing in the machine. So what I'm doing now is trimming a bit more of that extra fabric off so that I don't have as much to deal with when I put it in the machine, and just so it's a little easier to work with. I am still leaving plenty of seam allowance so that I can still sew this on the machine. So now what I'm doing is taking the spandex off of the foam so that I can take it over to the machine and sew it in the machine. I am also fixing a couple of rips that I had from draping it. This is a pretty normal thing to happen. The foam itself is not a very strong material, and it is pretty easy to rip if you pull your thread too tight or if you mess around with it too much. So I'm just fixing a couple of little areas, and then I will be sewing the spandex. So now I am sewing the spandex on the machine. I am using a small zigzag stitch, and I am pulling and stretching the fabric as I sew because it will be stretched out over the foam, and I don't want to cause any bubbling or rippling because my stitch is too tight, and I also don't want to pop any seams when I put it on the foam. So now I am going back in, trimming off any extra threads, as well as pulling out that running stitch that I did earlier, and then I will be trimming down the seam allowance to be as close as I can get it to that zigzag stitch that I did on the machine. So once I am done trimming off all those extra threads, pulling out the running stitch, and trimming the seam allowance, I am turning this right side out, and then I will be putting it back on the foam form. So here I am putting it back on the foam montrals. This does take a little bit of patience and time. It takes a lot of just manipulating the fabric and moving it around until you are happy with it. So just take your time and be patient. So here I am just moving the fabric around and trying to stretch it out and get it to sit where I want so it isn't causing any weird rippling or causing any weird shapes in the foam. It's not causing it to deform in a way I don't want it to. So it's just a lot of just moving it around, stretching out the fabric, moving the foam around until it sits how I want it to. I'm using a white acrylic paint in a fabric medium to put a base coat down over the entire headpiece. So once that base coat is dry, I am taking a pencil and looking at my reference picture, I am sketching out where all of the blue markings will be. So once I have all of the markings drawn out, I am ready to paint with my blue. So this is just plain blue acrylic paint. It does have some gray in it. Sometimes I will mix in some black and then just fill in all of those lines. So I use a thicker brush to kind of fill in the majority of the blue markings, and then I do go in with a thinner brush to get the edges and clean anything up that I need to. I do try to be as neat and careful as possible with this blue so I don't mess up the white. If necessary, you can go back in with some white acrylic paint and just cover up any spots that you may have messed up. And then once this paint is dry, the headpiece is done and ready to wear. This does just sit on my head like a hat. It doesn't have any attachments holding it on. And then to put any decorations or crowns on, I usually will hot glue them on. For this particular one, I did use magnets so I could change it out and put this crown on a different headpiece if I wanted to. And that is it. Let me know if you have any questions, comments, concerns in the comments below, and I will see you guys next video.